So in our last section, we're going to talk about supporting your feature. So your feature is live, right? We've already talked about the benefits, how to produce it, how to balance it, and now we're shipping it into the wild. What are the steps that you can do once your feature is live? First, as I've been saying all day, you can gather feedback. You can gather feedback from your community, you can gather feedback from your analytics, you can gather feedback from your team. You also want to start executing on your content rollout strategy. So what are the next steps in the feature? You can identify and resolve bugs and feature polish. You can also plan your content cadence. So what are the themes that are coming up for your feature? What are the improvements that you can sneak into your content cadence? And what are the hopes and dreams of your team for this feature? You can also revisit your backlog. So you can consider features that didn't make the first release. Remember, we did a lot of cutting during our minimum viable product. Now we can revisit those things and consider, are they appropriate to include in a future release? We can also design new features based on community feedback. And we can think about what the future of the system is going to be. So let's break down some of these points, starting with our feedback gathering. Let's start with initial reactions. We want to play and discuss the update with fans, as we've discussed. Being involved with the community shows them that you care, and also shows them that there are people behind the game that they love. You can connect with fans on social media. So actually, most of the discussions are going to occur on social media, whereas players are playing and enjoying your game, and you can observe them there. A lot of the meaningful conversations are going to occur online. You can engage in healthy conversation with your community. I know Twitter plus healthy conversation doesn't really happen. But all jokes aside, you can learn from your community. What did they like? What did they not care for? And how can the next update improve their experience? You can also browse message boards for player sentiment. In a similar vein, are there posts that are sharing cool experiences from your feature? That's great. You don't always have to just focus on the negative feedback. You can take a look at what are the experiences that players are sharing, and that can be a good indicator of some of the things that you can focus on your feature in the future. Are there criticisms of the feature? Can you engage in that conversation, or can you gather that feedback and consider what are the next steps in order to act upon that feedback? You can also gather ideas from your community. So you aren't the only creative person. When you release that feature, there's going to be a lot of hopes and dreams that are going to be created by your players after seeing and experiencing your feature. Let's say it's a pet feature and you only release cats and dogs. Maybe somebody's favorite pet is a rabbit and they would like to see that. You can browse, social media or your game for a lot of inspiration on what future themes and content you can create for your players. So what type of content does your community want? Your feature is going to spur a lot of that creativity from your players. And, this was a question that was asked before, but while you're going to get a lot of feedback from your players, you should always look at it under the lens as the designer and the creator. And are these requests in line with your vision? If not, is there some way that you can meet it halfway that is in line with your vision? Or are there other experiences that can resolve some of the issues that are raised by your players? You can also consider UGC. So is there a way to incorporate some of the fan-made creations into your game? Your players may suggest or even share artwork for ideas that they'd love to see. And UGC is a great way to incorporate the community and get them involved in your living, breathing game. It's also a great platform to show off all of your highly engaged players and celebrate some of the content that they've created. Now, I know what you're thinking, and I really want to caution you guys. Always, always, always ask for permission if you are thinking about incorporated fans' artwork. You just owe it to them and to yourself to share that this was something that they created. And you really don't want to be that person that's stealing others' ideas. You want to be celebrating and giving that artwork a platform in your game. All right, the next input for feedback are analytics, and we're really going to dive into it in this section. Your analytics are going to allow you to measure the performance of your feature in the form of your key performance indicators, feature funnels, and other things such as economy inputs. Your analytics are also going to help you to detect issues early. So if you see that there's a large drop off in your DAU, your daily active users, day over day, chances are there's some bug that you introduced in your feature that's not allowing some of your players to play. The sooner that you can resolve those issues, the faster that you can get your players back in the game and mitigate the risk of them dropping off or becoming frustrated with your experience. Analytics is also going to surface feature optimization, and we're really going to dig into this with your feature funnel, but it's going to help you to design future feature optimizations and improvements in order to improve the user experience and flow of your feature. So now that we've discussed that, I'd like to go through our key performance indicators. I know you've heard me and some other people throw out DAU, ARPU, all these other things. So we're going to break those down, and I want to talk about them under the lens of a game designer and how I use them and think about them when I'm designing my features. So we could break them down into three key categories, and I'm going to go through each of them individually. Our first set of metrics we can call our engagement metrics. They are essentially asking, how much is the player playing my game? When they're actually in the game, how are they interacting with my game? So there's several metrics that we can take a look at in order to measure that. Our first is our daily active users, which is our users that are playing daily. Our next one is our monthly active users. So how often are they playing? And then our third that we're going to cover today is our average session length, which is within a single session, how much are players playing? And finally, we're going to talk about our average sessions per day, which is the frequency within a single day that players are playing. So let's break down each of these. First one is our daily active users. And essentially what this is asking is how many unique players are playing during that day. So if I'm looking at my DAU, or my daily active users for yesterday, I'm saying how many unique individual players logged into my game for some amount of time. So in terms of your game expansion, this is useful for understanding the initial impact of your game expansion. Ideally, when you're releasing that major release, you're going to see a huge pop in players that are coming in to see what content is in your game. The other common use for your daily active users is to have a general pulse for the health of your game. If it's a Tuesday and you see that there's about a 50% drop off in players who are playing versus yesterday, chances are there's some game breaking bug and you need to resolve it. The one thing that I want to caution you against with your daily active users is to understand that it's subject to weekend and holiday traffic. So obviously, there's going to be a lot of players playing during Christmas. And also for Roblox, there's going to be a lot of players that are playing on weekends versus weekdays when they're at work or at school. Our next metric that we're going to cover are our monthly active users. Very similar to daily active users, but we're looking at it at a lens of over a month. So how many unique players are playing during that month? This is useful for understanding how our game is trending. And it's another metric for understanding the current health of our game. However, even more so than our daily active users, our monthly active users is going to be highly subject to seasonality. So what I mean by that is December is going to have a very large amount of traffic, whereas March might have very little traffic. So don't try and compare your March stats with your December stats. That's not a really fair comparison. More realistically, if your game has been out for more than a year, you can take a look at how your game was performing in March of last year and how it's performing this year to understand, over a long term, how your game has been performing. Has it been growing? Has it been shrinking? And if it's been shrinking, what can you do to assist with that? All right, our next metric is our average session length. So this is asking the question from the time the player has loaded into the game, how long are they playing before they exit out of the game in a single session? So this is a good metric for measuring the impact of engagement focused features. So for example, for a daily quest where we want them to do, let's say, three quests within a single session, we can see if that actually impacted that metric by taking a look at our average session length and saying, hey, whereas before our average session was 8 minutes, now it's 10 minutes. This feature has been successful. So one note with this one is that this is going to be subject to your game genre and your core game mechanics. If you are a very casual experience where you come in, you collect from a few things, and then you quit, very obviously that's going to have a much shorter natural session length than a game where you're logging in, hopping into a dungeon in World Zero and fighting a boss, which might take much longer than that. For me personally, as an economy designer, I like to use this metric when I'm balancing a feature because I'm trying to think about the overall experience of the player, every task that they're trying to do in a single session, and how much of that real estate I should be using up with the feature that I'm introducing. So, as an economy designer, this is a very valuable resource. And then, similar to this, and I didn't list it here and I'm not going to walk through it, but I talked about your average session length per day. And that one is just saying, okay, in a single session, they're logging in and quitting, but they might have multiple of those sessions in a day. So all that metric is telling me is on average, how many sessions are they playing in a single day? So those are our engagement metrics. Are there any questions on those before I move on?
We do have some questions, kind of
Okay.
covering a range of things.
Okay.
All right. So Thunder1222 says, how do you go about receiving good feedback from players with no social media or they are not old enough to use Discord, etc.?
Hopping into game would be your best input there. Or if you have a group, you can also gather feedback there. I don't know how much interaction occurs in groups, but anywhere where you can have conversation, that's going to be useful. So a good point, and thank you, Tom, for pointing this one out. But there's two different things you can do. You have your dev account and you have your super secret account. If you want to get feedback on how the player is playing the game, you should be the undercover CEO hopping into your game, seeing what players are doing that way. If you want to get actual feedback on the feature, you want to hop on your dev account and hop into the game because obviously that's going to derail every player's experience as they come to see the celebrity dev and give them their feedback on the feature. So for those that are underage, that's a good way to get that feedback and that input from players.
Awesome. All right. Tech Spectrum asks, what are your thoughts on using events as a way to test a new idea on a smaller scale so that if it fails, it was only an event and can be removed with less criticism? Otherwise, it can be put into the core loop. This is what they did on Speedrun Simulator.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and it is a strategy. It depends on the scope of the feature. If this is a feature that you are going to be working on for 3 months, you should try and build it to last. If it's something that you think you can put together in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I think that's an excellent strategy. Release it as a limited time event, see what the player reception is. If they love it, maybe you dedicate more resources to that feature and you make it a fully fleshed out feature that's a part of the core loop. If it's something they hate, maybe you go back to the drawing board and iterate on it and then release it again as a limited time event and see if the reception is any different.
Great. So Missimo asks, what do you do if your community really wants a certain feature, but it doesn't go with your core loop or gameplay? Do you have to cave and give it to people what they want or stand by your convictions?
No, never cave. If you strongly feel that a feature is not right for your game, you should never put it in your game. So to take a step back and think about it, player feedback, you can look at it this way. Players are excellent at identifying a problem in your game, right? Because they're playing your game, they experience it. Even if they can't, vocalize what the problem is, they can subconsciously think about that. It is then your responsibility when they're giving you a request to dissect it, think about what is the problem that they're presenting. And then your responsibility as the designer is to design a solution for it. So if they're asking for a feature repeatedly and you don't want to do it, you can also take the next step and think, okay, but what is the actual problem they're presenting? And what is a solution I'm comfortable with introducing in the game that is in line with my vision for the experience of the game?
Got it. All right. I think this is the last one. I think Gnome Code is asking how you go about getting your community to produce UGC for you.
Ask for it. You can go on Discord and you can say, hey, if you love the game, if you love this feature, we'd love to hear your ideas. There's a billion idea guys out there. They're gonna send out, a ton of ideas to you. But also, you can take a look at like fan art, right? What is some fan art people are making of your game? Or maybe you even have a competition like, hey, we're gonna have a fan art competition, and top 3 winners are going to get an actual pet in the game based off of their creation or something, right? These are ways that you could sort of crowdsource for that. Just remember that you should make it abundantly clear throughout the process that this is something you intend to incorporate in your game. So that way nobody feels like this content's being stolen. And then the other thing is like, don't just look solely for like free handouts. Don't just go to an artist, a builder, and just be like, hey, make me stuff for free. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is we're seeing somebody drew a cute panda on Twitter and said, I would love for this pet to be in the game. And then we're going back and we're creating a panda based off of their creation. So that's the difference in it. You're not like getting free work out of people. You're taking their passion and you're creating it in real life in your game. Okay. Then moving on, we're going to move on to arguably the most important set of metrics that you're going to take a look at, which are your retention metrics. Retention metrics are asking the question, did the player come back after this period of time? So we're going to break down each of these, starting with our day one retention, or as we call it, D1 retention. This is asking the question, what percent of players who played for the first time, we refer to that as D0. So their very first day that they played is D0. What percent of players that played for the first time returned on the second day, which we call D1? So this is a very, very critical metric that we track. And the reason for this is that it measures how well you onboarded new users and demonstrated the fun of your game, right? This is where ultimately the biggest difference between free-to-play games and paid games is when you go to a store and you buy a game for $20, you've already made your investment. So even if the first 5 minutes of the game are miserable an experience, you're still going to play because you paid $20 for that game. With free to play, especially with how low of friction it is to get into your game and out on Roblox, if your experience is not fun within the first 5 minutes, a player is going to be frustrated, quit, and is exponentially unlikely to come back to your game. So you want to give a lot of love and care to those first 5 minutes to make sure A, they're getting into your experience, they're enjoying your core loop, and that they're finding the fun in your game immediately. So if you see that this metric is low, this is one that you really want to think about. What can I do to create a more intuitive experience for my player? What can I do to demonstrate, really that moment of joy, that fun in my game? So our next set of metrics, you can measure this in two different ways. They tell you relatively the same thing. The first is your day 7 retention. So again, similar to D1 retention, this is asking what percent of players who started playing 7 days prior returned on the 8th day. And then our week 1 retention, which is asking a similar thing. Week 0 is the first week that the player is playing. So we're asking what percent of players who started playing on the first week returned on our second week, which we refer to as our week 1 retention. So the difference between this and our day 1 retention is now this number is indicating how well our progression systems, our short, medium, long-term goals are at motivating the player to continue playing. If we see issues with our day 7 retention, this is normally indicating that our player is unsure of what they're working towards the next day. Ultimately, you win with this metric when in a player's off time, when they're just waking up during the day or they're just going to bed, they're thinking, man, what am I accomplishing in this game tomorrow? That's what your day 7 retention should be answering. So if you see that there's some softness here, you want to think about what are some goals that you can give players? What's a system that you can introduce that gives your players goals over the long term? Our last set of retention metrics is our day 30 and our month 1 retention. So day 30 is asking what percent of players who started playing 30 days prior are returning on our 31st day, so our D30 day. And month 1 retention is saying for our players in their first month, month 0, how many are coming back in the second month? So this also deals with our player goals, but it's in a different system. This measures how well your elder and end game systems are engaging your advanced players. At some point, your players are going to hit the level cap in your game, or they're going to hit what we call the end game. So what systems do you have in place that are sustainable, that are evergreen, that are going to keep your players playing? So this might sound familiar because we talked about this all day with our game expansions, but yes, a majority of our game expansions are dealing with this question. They're saying, how do I keep my player playing over the long term? What are long-term goals that I can get players to be thinking about? before they go to bed at night, what are they thinking about they're trying to accomplish a month from now that they're logging in the next day in order to achieve? So again, this is not a hard rule for all of your game expansions. You can target any one of these metrics with it, but typically you're trying to create evergreen systems for this metric. That's the most common one that you'll see. All right, moving on to our last set, and these are developers' most favoritist of metrics. It's our monetization metrics. We're asking, are we making money? How are we making money? So don't really need to explain this one too much. So let's dive on into each of these metrics with our first one, which is our average revenue per daily active user. So this metric is asking the question for all players in the game, all players, not payers, but players, every single player in our game. What is the average amount of money that each player spends? So the thing you have to keep in mind is for a free to play game, actually a majority of your users are spending 0 Robux. They're not spending any amount. However, we're taking those players and we're clumping them in with all of the other players who are spending in the game. And we're saying for each player, how much on average are they spending? So this metric I like to use generally as a pulse for how healthy the monetization is in the game. This one, you don't have to follow too closely. The next two metrics are arguably more important, but this is going to give you the overall health of your monetization systems in your game. So if one day you saw that you were at 1 cent ARPDAU, as we call it, and the next day you're at, half a cent ARPDAU, you might want to look under the hood and see what problems are there. Our next one, and arguably the single most important monetization metric, is our conversion rate. This is asking for all players, what percent have spent anything in the game? So if you spend even 1 Robux in the game, you have triggered this metric. You are part of the percentage that is actually spent in the game. So the reason why this is most important for a monetization is the theory behind it, which is that a player who spends once in your game is exponentially more likely to spend again in the future and to continue to play your game. So this sort of hits two really nice points. The one is that you have players that continue to engage in the game, because similar to my example before with the box product that they spend $20, now there's a monetary investment in your game. So players are even more engaged in your game and they want to continue to play with your game because they spent. The other one, and relevant to this entire slide right here, is now that they've spent before, they've experienced, what a good experience, hopefully, it was to spend in your game. So they're going to be a lot more willing to spend again in the future. So for this metric, we don't care if you spent 1 Robux, because chances are you're going to spend again in the future. And you're likely to spend even more on your subsequent purchase. Whereas before you spent 100 Robux, now you might spend 500 Robux on something, right? So this is a very important metric to track. And so for a game designer, when I'm looking at this metric, I am using it as an indicator of how valuable the purchases are for players and how well surfaced they are. Did I surface those opportunities for them to spend well enough? Very often you see this in the form of like a new player package where it's a limited time thing and they can purchase it. But also, like, what is the value proposition? Did I present good enough value to a player? Am I presenting a cute, adorable animal that they really, really want? Or am I presenting like 100 coins that they could have gotten by like 5 minutes of gameplay, right? So that's what that is an indicator of. Once you've sort of triggered that and that's at a healthy rate, your next largest or most important monetization metric to track is your average revenue per paying user, or your ARPU. So this is for all players that have spent in a game. So for all payers, what is the average amount that they have spent? Now you're exclusively looking at the players who have spent in your game and only spent in your game. So this one is used to indicate this, what we call the spend depth in the game, which is how much players are willing to spend in the game. So for a game designer, this is demonstrating to me, are we continuing to offer value to these players? Are we motivating them to want to spend multiple times? This is often where, as I mentioned earlier, repeat spend comes in, where maybe we're offering consumables that they enjoy and now they're coming back to consume them again. Or maybe we're refreshing this over time in the form of content cadence, like we're constantly updating skins in their game, new pets, new furniture, new houses, etc. So this one is indicating how healthy the spend is. And if you see that this is low, there's sort of two things that are at play here. One is that their first experience wasn't nice, so they didn't enjoy spending, so they're not spending again. Or the second one is you were too generous in your first offering. So people spent and are like, great, I'm set on this game. I don't have to spend anymore. So you should give some thought to which one that is. And if you find that they're not spending a lot because of the latter reason, then you want to think about like what value are actually offering and what's a fair value to actually offer to your players. Any questions on monetization metrics before we move on?
Yeah, well, I'll just say it because it's taking people on to type. What are your thoughts on like allowing developers to charge a scripted price rather than a static price, such as not just a developer product with a set price, like 2,500 coins is maybe 250 Robux. What if they want to buy something specific and we charge them a calculated price in game? Uh, that could be done, from a scripter? Like, do you think there's value in that?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I'm going to preface this with I don't know the tech behind the scenes whether you guys are allowed to do this or not right now. However, I will say throughout the industry, this is a common best practice, and the reason for that, we call it prorating a price. So basically, we say depending on where your progression is in the game, or depending on how much you have, we allow you to spend the difference. So one thing that you'll see this with is like a soft currency, like your coins, where early on in the game, we don't want you to be able to just buy 100,000 coins right away. So we're not going to make that an option, or we're going to make it prohibitively expensive. Like you're going to have to spend $100 to get 100,000 coins because it's going to ruin your experience, and we don't want you to do it, right? Whereas buying 100 coins, we might charge you 25 Robux, let's say. Then when a player is at level 50, now buying 25 Robux only costs them 1 Robux because it's pretty irrelevant for them at that point in progression because they can earn, those coins at any time. Versus now the 100,000 coin becomes something that's like insight for them or they can purchase. So maybe we charge like $5 for it instead, whatever the equivalent is in Robux. I guess it's like 400 Robux or something. So we like scale that price scripted wise over time. So that's like one of the reasons why you do that. The other one is like in the form of like maybe there's a timer. So like you have to wait 12 hours to like to let's say harvest the crop, right? And at the initial 12 hours, we're going to charge you 100 Robux in order to skip that timer. Versus when you're about 5 minutes out, we're going to charge you 1 Robux to do so, right? So we actually like scale down that time. That's another form of like prorating prices that you're going to see. Again, I don't know if we allow that right now, so don't, go to my boss and say, Dan told me to do this. But those are common practices that I've seen throughout that have been effective elsewhere. Speaking of, let's talk about feature funnels. I know Red Manta had talked about this before. I'm also going to rave about them because they are one of the most powerful tools that you can use to optimize your feature. So a feature funnel allows you to track the actions in a feature to see a player's overall progress and pain points. So what I mean by that is, let's say that we're releasing a pet feature, and the flow for it is that you need to open the store, select a pet in the store, purchase a pet, and then you need to go to your inventory, equip the pet, and feed the pet. So programmatically, what we're doing is in the background for our analytics, we're firing an event for each of these actions. When the player opens a store, we're firing an event. When they select a pet, we're firing an event. When they're feeding the pet, we're firing an event, right? We're firing one for each of these. And then in analytics, we're taking a look at what percent of all players that loaded into the game fired each of these actions. And what you're going to see is that it sort of forms this staircase where there's always some drop off in between each of these steps. You're not going to have 100 players or 100% of players complete your actions, but you're going to see what percent of players are completing your action. This is going to give you a lot of valuable insights because depending on the step in the feature, you're going to be able to form hypotheses for where there are fail points, right? So this is going to identify pain points at huge drop-offs in between the completion steps. So in the example we're presenting here, we see that whereas we had, let's say, 70% of all players who purchased a pet, now we see that there is maybe only 40% of those players actually equip the pet. So we can say What are some of the potential causes of this? Maybe we need to work on our UI and UX for equipping pet. Maybe it's unclear where in the inventory it is. Maybe the whole equip process once you're in the inventory is unclear, right? So by setting up this feature funnel, you can directionally see where there are pain points for your players, and you can optimize that experience to create a better experience for your players over time. All right, moving on, we're going to talk about our feature team retro. So a retro helps you and your team reflect upon the development progress or process. The common form that it comes in is in 3 questions. It's what went well during development, what didn't go well during development, and what can be improved, right? So retros help your team reflect on the feature that was developed. Did it meet our expectations? Was this the feature that we set out to make? Is there any core features that need to be added or iterated upon in future updates? And where will the feature go from here? This is a good practice because it gives you valuable insights on as a team as to how you're working with one another, where your pain points are, and where you can optimize your feature development. So your retros allow you and your team to review all of your feedback as well. You can sit down with your team now that you've gathered your community feedback, your analytics, and your social media, and you can set out to prioritize that feedback and decide what actually matters, and what you should action on next. So you have your feedback from your team. Now, what are the steps that you need to take? First, obviously, you want to capture all of your feedback in some sort of software. Then you also want to prioritize your feedback. I'll talk about this in a slide coming up. And then you want to break it down for your planned releases. So hopping in to capture our feedback. With a production management software, you should be capturing all of the feedback. You should be capturing it from your community. You should be capturing it from social media. You should be capturing it from analytics. And finally, through your team retro, you should be capturing all of your team feedback. Then you want to also consider your feature backlog. In prioritizing your feedback, you want to discuss with your team what is the most important to tackle. And I want to break this down into 3 high-level things. First is severity, which is how critical is this issue to fix in a subsequent release? Obviously, game-breaking issues, exploits, crashes are the highest priority, whereas nice-to-have features are a much lower priority. You can also think about if it's a piece of feedback from several different streams or stakeholders, or if this was one individual on Twitter who angrily tweeted at you and wants you to make a change. You can also consider if there's an important feature that just didn't make the cut in the initial release, but was something that you were planning to implement immediately the next time that you have the bandwidth to do so. The next input that you want to consider is your input, or your impact. So would implementing the feedback greatly improve the feature? How meaningful will these changes be to your players? And what are the best pieces of feedback to implement based on the return of investment, right? So you could think about this in terms of, is there one person on your team that needs to spend 2 hours working on this for a huge bang for your buck? Or is this going to require the entire team to do over the next month? So that's how you need to measure the impact of this. This bakes into your cost, right? So how expensive is this to actually implement? Would it require a couple hours from a single developer or a month from the entire team? And going back into our impact, what is the impact as a result of that? Planning your release. So once your feedback is prioritized, you can break it down into planned releases and add it to your release roadmap. What are the tasks that would make sense to be included in the same release? What resources are available to work on these changes? And finally, is there a release on the roadmap that thematically would make sense to include these changes? Any questions on that before we move on to our content rollout strategy?
Sure, I've got one, Dan. So, do you have any suggestions for strategies for getting, open and honest feedback, especially when it comes to your team in a retrospective?
Yeah, that's a good question because giving feedback for some people can be very hard. They don't want to hurt feelings. And the sad part about that is the team misses out on a lot of valuable feedback if people are apprehensive to give that feedback. So there's a few things you can do. As a lead, you can set up some sort of anonymous input where they can give that feedback. Slido is a way to do it. You could also do it via email. They send it to you. You could even just, get a shoebox, cut a hole in it, and allow them to slip pieces of paper in there. Any sort of feedback is going to be valuable. So you should try and create the most welcoming experience possible for people to be able to give that feedback.
All right. Um, how many times have you seen something like a rewrite of an existing game actually have a good outcome versus doing just a second game? So instead of like rewriting a game you have to make it better, do you think it's just smarter to make a 2.0 of that game, just a new one?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I see it as like a common practice from developers. I'm going to caveat this with I don't have any data to back up this statement I'm about to say. So just take this purely as my own opinion. I feel that if you have the ability to overhaul your game in the existing place that you have, especially if you have a pretty big following for that place, you should do so there. Anytime that you're creating a new space, you're essentially starting from scratch with the number of followers that are joining. And even though you might have some like feedback forums like Discord or Twitter where people are following you, there's still a percentage of players that don't use any of those streams that are suddenly going to see that the game that they're currently playing is dead and scratch their head and question why. So, in my opinion, if you can overhaul your game in the existing place, you should do so there. Now, if your player base is already small enough that it's not necessarily going to matter, you have like, 50 people playing your current space, you can scrap that. You can start up a new space. But I would strongly encourage you guys that, like, unless this is a true sequel to your game and it's fundamentally different from the first experience to the point that changing that first experience essentially kills an existing game, you should strive to do so in the existing space that you are, because it's actually more work for you to have it in that second space and have to like rebuild that player base again.
I have a question, Dan.
Okay.
For devs who are like a team of one and trying to collect feedback from like the community, I know it can get overwhelming because there's so many different places that you get it. You can get it from Twitter, you can get it from Discord, you can get it from your own game page. What is the best way for someone who's a team of one wanting to get this feedback and not trying to feel overwhelmed in doing so?
Good question. I've already disclaimed that I'm not the social media guy, but the answer to that without giving this specific answer is whichever one is going to give you the most valuable feedback. If you feel like your group is giving you the most actionable feedback, or if you feel like a Discord is giving you the most actionable feedback, as a solo dev, you only have so many hours in the day. So you don't want to spread yourself too thin. I would say pick the one that you most prefer, that you feel like you're getting the most valuable feedback from, and use that as your source for feedback. Ideally, personally for me, I would pick one where I can, generate my own community. So that might be like my own game page group, or it might be Discord. But if you prefer like Twitter or something like that, you can go for that instead.
Thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? All right, we're in our final stretch here. Let's talk about our content rollout strategy. I know I've been referring to it a bit, but let's talk about some actionable things that you can be doing. First, you should be thematically planning your future updates or your future releases. So, one strategy that's common is beyond holidays, leaning on what players know from culture, movies, books, holidays, whatever is applicable for your game. So, very obviously, if you're like a medieval fantasy themed game, you should not be looking to Area 51 for inspiration. You should be looking at, popular genres like Game of Thrones or, Harry Potter or something for your inspiration. The reason why for these systems, for specific systems, you should try and be theming it is because unthemed content becomes difficult for a user to understand or value the things that are released. So a very common example that I give is like, let's say that we have a pet feature, right? In our very first release, we decide we're just going to release every type of animal we can think of under the sun. We have cats, we have dogs, we have giraffes, we have polar bears, we have dragons, right? The problem with this is that for a player, they're not really going to understand the value of each of these things relative to one another. And we're going to have difficulty as a developer displaying that value. Like, how valuable is a giraffe versus a polar bear, right? Versus if we're doing, domestic cat and dog, and we have a very rare breed of a cat, right, as our most valuable thing, that's much more understandable by our players. The second reason for that, as a game designer, is that we design the best content under constraints. So when I say, what pets are we going to make next, right? The path of least resistance in the brain is very often going to go back to where we were before. We're like, I don't know, I think dragons are cool. Let's just do another dragon. Versus if I say, what reminds me of the Arctic, right, for pets? Now I can start to think about stuff in that constraint box. So I think of penguins, I think of polar bears, I think of sea lions, those are the things that come to mind. And as a result, you end up being more creative, not less creative, because you're designing in those constraints. The other reason for it from a business standpoint is sustainability. If you're releasing everything under the sun in your first release, you're gonna have a lot more difficulty releasing thematic content, over time. And then the last thing that you lose out if you're not theming your content is when you're theming that release, you can tie it into other systems in your game. It doesn't just have to be the Safari pet release. You can also release furniture. You can release housing systems. You can release cosmetics for players to make the entire game feel like this living, breathing update, right? So there's just so many benefits to theming your releases versus just releasing everything under the sun. The other thing for your strategy is that you want to be incorporating feature improvements in each of your releases. Depending on the team resources that you have available, try and incorporate feedback and improvements you've prioritized in each of your releases. Players didn't like how they were equipping pets in the past. This is your perfect opportunity during the Safari update to incorporate a better flow for that. Including improvements and updates to the feature itself will keep the experience fresh in addition to the thematic content that you include. Again, I'm a broken record, but for each release that you should always collect feedback upon the release. Listening to and acting upon feedback will make you a better developer. And it also shows the community that you respect them and that you care about their opinion. And then at the end of the day, with all the feedback that you gather, remember that it's your team's vision that ultimately you should be pushing out, not just the loudest voice that's in the room. So in closing, before we go to our last Q&A for the day, take risks and show the world what you're made of. We're creative people. This is an industry of passion, and game expansions are the best way to show the world your talents, your passion, and your skills. Your job as a designer is to find the best solution, not always the one that you come up with. So seeking ideas from your team will help you land on the best experience possible. It gives your entire team buy-in in the vision, and passion is what creates the best experiences possible. And finally, this is a Roblox core value, so you should apply it as well. Respect your community. Player goodwill is your single most important currency, so never do anything to, betray your players, to make them feel like you don't actually care. The other thing that I said in our Q&A earlier is that players are excellent at identifying problems, but not the best at coming up with solutions. The solutions are your job, not theirs. So think about what it is that are the pain points for them and create the best experience possible. And lastly, communication is key. You're not always going to release the best or the most successful release, but through communication with your players, through understanding, through getting your feedback, you're eventually going to get to the best iteration of each feature possible. And with that, I'm going to open it up to the last questions of the day.
There is nothing in Slido.
Stumped them. Got it. Well, thank you again for coming today. I really appreciate you all being here.